All right, this is Alen and Leon. Welcome to the Seize the Moment podcast. And today we're going to talk to you about what inspires you, who inspires you, who's inspired us. Yeah.
And welcome to episode 6. I can't believe it's already episode 6.
Actually, yeah. Mark White last week was awesome.
Yeah.
Talking to him about superheroes, Batman, Captain America, The Thing, got me to thinking, actually, about different figures in pop culture, and not even pop culture, even things that are kind of underground, the things that inspire us, and that inspire people in general, like stories, music, books, all across the spectrum. Yeah. And actually, I wanted to talk to you about, what inspires you, and maybe also talk about what inspires me too, and maybe see if any of those things kind of resonate maybe with our audience. Yeah. And maybe if they'll find inspiration in that, and maybe it could influence them to do all sorts of things. And there's actually why I wanted to talk about this is there's actually things about you I don't even know that is I'm actually genuinely interested in knowing what has inspired you to become who you are. Like as a psychotherapist right now, you also opened up your own office recently, which is very like a big step. Yeah. And it's really interesting, like from the outside to watch this, and I'm like, what makes someone into who they are? What are the influences? What are the things that they kind of go through that brings them to where they're at?
Yeah. So, I mean, as I'm sure you guys at this point know, which is not a secret, right, that sort of Alen and I were broadcasted on the O4L online network, so which is the home of the Outlaws, the hip-hop legends, the group that Tupac Shakur founded. And so when I kind of think of, let's say, well, first let me just talk about the sort of practical things that inspire me, or the practical people. Definitely my friends, definitely my family. Right, so the thing is, one of the major reasons why I was able to open up the office was because literally all of you guys. Because at first I was completely terrified. I was like, there's no way that this fucking thing is ever going to happen. And so kind of little by little through your encouragement that, kind of gave me the strength to actually go out on my own and figured, whatever, what's the worst that can happen? And so, but in terms of the kind of social safety net that we have and the social network that we have, I think that's the most important thing, right? Sort of outside of the particular stories and the particular figures who kind of help us lead better lives. Because I think more so than anything are sort of, I think I said this in that episode that we did on self-sabotage, where sort of our own heroes are not necessarily ourselves, or even like, let's say, kind of, cultural figures, but a lot of times they're the people in our lives. But kind of going back to sort of, the more kind of pop culture figures. So it's definitely Tupac Shakur. And so what I often think about, especially when, let's say I'm going through a difficult time, is this poem called The Rose That Grew From Concrete. And so for me, that's one of my favorite poems and literally one of sort of the best things I've ever read in the entire world. And so Tupac talks about this sort of this, let's say this scenario, or rather kind of this environment, right? That's essentially, it's a ghetto, right? So it's an environment where essentially nothing good comes out of, or at least seemingly so. And so then, sort of people kind of walk by and essentially they notice this sort of rose, right? And it's a little bit tilted. It has sort of, let's say, kind of broken petals, right? It's sort of tilted and crooked and tilted to the side. And so, and he talks about the fact that, kind of people walk by and for like a split second they're sort of amazed by it, but then they're like, but look at the way it looks, right? It's actually not that beautiful if you actually look at it. And so the way Tupac describes it is he's like, you guys are like, you're not seeing the beauty in it. The fact that a fucking rose, can grow out of the sidewalk, out of the concrete, is one of the most amazing and beautiful things in the world. The fact that it has this sort of will to reach the sun is incredible, because it's so impossible and probably, and likely improbable too, right? Obviously.
Is that like allegorical to what it's... I can't imagine what it's like to live in the ghetto. Yeah. But does the concrete probably represent the ghetto, and the rosebud is probably him?
Yeah, it's him and it's everybody else, right? It's sort of everybody who's sort of come out that situation. And so what was so beautiful about the poem is that it's not necessarily about, he's not saying like, this is me, right? And I want you guys to sort of marvel at me. He's saying like, no, this is like literally all of us who've sort of risen up at the slums, as he said in one of his songs. It's about all of us who kind of came out and came from this situation that in terms of kind of probability told us that there was no possible way that you can ever be anything, let's say anything special, anything that has anything to do with being successful. And so for him, the rose in the self, right, that even though it is sort of hard, right, and and it has been sort of hardened by life, and maybe it isn't the sort of most kind of polished thing in the world or the most polished object. The fact that it is still a rose, right? It's as broken and as damaged as it is. That's how incredible it is. That it doesn't matter that it isn't perfect, right? It's not the point. The point is that it wasn't even supposed to be there in the first place, and yet somehow it managed to rise up.
And just struggling to kind of grow in that environment that normally it wouldn't be able to grow in.
Yeah.
That is pretty interesting, yeah. For me, since we're talking about music, which is interesting, I think about, okay, well, some of my favorite music was like back in the day, like Linkin Park. Have you ever heard of a group called Apocalyptica?
No.
They're cool. They're like this instrumental group. They use like violins, guitar. It's kind of like a metal kind of sound to it. And I remember back in the day, I would just listen to them, and this is instrumental. There's no words, right? So it's not like a poem that translates like a meaning that way. But when I listened to that, it would like build up these feelings. Like I get goosebumps. I feel like really good. And like during the times in my life when things weren't so great, so to speak, I listened to music like that, and it would put me in a great space, like a really great space. Where anything I did from that space, it basically helped me to act sometimes. Like things like that, or when I think about movies, and going back... Oh,
I do have a question for you.
Yeah.
So were there any particular lyrics that inspired you, that sort of you look back on and you're like, wow, man, like there were times in my life where I could go back to this...
I'm so happy you asked.
that I could go back to this song.
Okay, great. So, have you ever heard of Disturbed?
Yes.
Okay. So, wow. There were... Now, I'm trying to think of specific lyrics. Okay, there's this one song from not Disturbed's latest album, I believe it's called Evolution.
Yeah.
The one before that. For some reason I'm blanking on the name, but that's fine. If somebody wants to look it up, they could figure it out. There's this one song, and I'm so happy I could remember this because I was struggling for a second there. It's called Who Taught You How to Hate? And there's like there's this line in there. I'm not gonna sing it, but they're like, who taught you how to hate? It's not in your blood. It's not a part of what you're made. And then let this be understood. And he says it like very powerfully. And like when I first heard that, I got goosebumps. Two, I like really resonated with that. I was like, yeah, we're not. I mean, are we born hating? I mean, you can argue this, I'm sure, and you could say, I'm sure somebody could wax about genetics and maybe say maybe some people are genetically predisposed to anger and this and that, more so than some others.
Well, not necessarily hate, though. You know.
Yeah, so back to that. Yeah, it's like making a statement. It's like we're not born hating. It's something that we're taught.
Right.
And that is very interesting because it makes you think about, well then, if that's what we're taught, what else can we teach? And I feel like that song is almost telling you that statement. And so when I hear it, I'm thinking, okay, if you could teach someone how to hate, you could teach them inversely, how to love. Yeah. And kind of brings me back to probably why we do this podcast and why I post some stuff on, let's say, Ego Ends Now, or with your blog. It's like you're putting something out there that's, how do I put this? It feels like this may not be correct, but it feels like a lot of the things that are in the mainstream, like when we think about the news or something like that, for some reason my mind goes straight to the news. I think there's a lot of negativity, and a lot of negativity is kind of what grabs our attention, right? And yes, that does have to do with a lot of psychological triggers, and there's a reason why marketers use that negative aspect to attract us and grab our attention. Fair enough. But from the other side, I feel like we're inundated too much with negativity, and not enough good, positive sources that that perhaps when those are explored, it brings out the better angels of our nature,
right.
as Steven Pinker would say.
So it's like you're saying that the kind of, maybe unintentionally, obviously, or involuntarily, that the media gives us reasons, right, if even implicit, to hate other people, right, through their sort of news stories and the cycles of news stories. No, I mean...
Yeah, I mean, plus, it's almost... well, it's like we have this mechanism already in us that separates us either into tribes or by race, creed, color, preferences, things like that. And that's something, yeah, we naturally have in us, but plus that aspect of what is taught is kind of what creates our society or individuals as well. So, yeah, like these stories or music, it's interesting how when we put that kind of stuff out there, it can really change the mind of an individual or the mind of, it depends how much influence they have, but potentially of a collective, whether it's a society, country, state,
and
whatever.
It's interesting because I think genetically speaking that we have a predisposition to categorize, right, like people, things, you name it. But I don't necessarily think that, like, kind of we were talking about, that the hate itself is learned, right? Maybe the fear isn't, because we also tend to think, or let's say we tend to fear things that are not known to us. But I mean, it's obviously argued elsewhere that that's where the hate stems from. But there's obviously kind of this idea or this reality that the hate is also fostered or fueled, right, by kind of, let's say, your elders in the group. And so, interestingly enough, I don't know if you knew this, but so Tupac had this concept, right, and so this idea.
Yeah. That's going back to something I did in one of our episodes, like this concept, this idea. Yeah.
So he had this sort of this moniker, right? He called it Thug Life, and so the way kind of like, let's say, mainstream media kind of, let's say, understood it, or the way the politicians at the time understood it, was the symbol of hate, right? Thug Life, right? Like, I'm this person who wants to sort of do harm, right? Because maybe some harm was done to me, or maybe just because I'm reckless and careless. But the point is that there was actually an acronym, and you know what it stood for?
No, what?
The hate you give little infants fucks everyone.
What?
Yeah, that's what was so fucking cool about it.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, so that's where, now that you said the hate you give, wasn't there like a documentary or a
book? Movie, yes.
Movie?
The Angie Thomas book that was turned into a movie, The Hate You Give. So that was based on pretty much, in great part, on Tupac Shakur's music.
Wow. Okay, see, you learn things every day. I didn't know that. That's cool.
Yeah, so, I mean, for him, the understanding was that, like, and this sort of goes back to even James Baldwin, right? Mm-hmm. Where when we talk about the ghetto and when we talk about sort of people's upbringings and their environments, I mean, even kind of like, let's say, studies of race, right, which I'm obviously in no way an expert on, but they tell you that, let's say, after slavery, the idea was that certain people were segregated, obviously, into these communities where there weren't many jobs, right, if any at all, where there wasn't sort of any great education or any sort of foundation for, let's say, a positive, or, let's say, for a good school system, right, kind of for lack of a better term. And so for them, right, they kind of really didn't have many other options outside of, like, let's say, like selling drugs, right, kind of, let's say, stealing, doing any other sorts of illegal activities. And so the point was that if you kind of take this concept of the hate you give and you apply it to those environments, the idea was that as a society and as a culture, more importantly, as a country, we gave these people this hate, right, by sort of segregating them and sort of by telling them to fend for themselves, and then we wonder why they come back and they do these things that, at some point, or to some extent, might be horrible, right? Which is not to obviously say that a good amount of them, or a good amount of people in the ghetto, right? I grew up in the projects, right? And I can tell you most of the people that I knew there weren't bad people. But then we kind of asked this question of, like, oh, well, why are some people, like, let's say, from those ghettos or from those communities like that? And I mean, we have nobody else to look for or look toward but ourselves and but this country and the way it's been structured, right? And then on top of that, when, let's say, you do have, like, a vast number of people who do try to do good and do try to sort of go about and live their lives, and let's say just try to kind of get by and support their families, what happens is they experience discrimination on all sorts of levels, right? From kind of when you go and look at the sort of the police and you look at the sort of the precincts, the way they're treated, even, let's say, in potential in offices of potential employers, right? So it's like they get a sense of this sort of hopelessness. And so for Pac, what he talked about was, and why he wrote his music, was he said, I really am doing this for the kid who's living a thug life and feels like it's hopeless. So he's like, for the music that's sort of popular, right? Or rather, not even that, the music that sort of, that is popular, but it's not meant sort of just to be popular in itself per se. It's meant to have this strong message. He said, look, the regular person is going to pick it up and he's going to be like, wow, yo, this shit is hot, right? I'm going to listen to it, right? I'm going to bump this, right? And then he's going to move on to something else. But for the kid that the song resonates with, which for me was me, obviously, right? For him, that song is going to stick with them and they're going to be able to do something with it. They're going to be able to take that message and use it to inspire themselves. Or they're going to be inspired by that message to live a better life and to sort of be more fulfilled and live, let's say, the more hopeful way. But the point was that, like, for the music, it was meant to be for those people who were downtrodden. And this was the same story with, like, Johnny Cash, right? Why he wrote Man in Black, which a song which I absolutely love. He said, I wrote this for the poor and the beaten down, living in the hopeless, hungry side of town, right? Wow. Because for a lot of these people, without this music, they had nothing else, right? If you kind of go back to the 18th century when people wrote, let's say, kind of what were at the time riveting novels. They didn't write novels about poor people. They wrote them about the aristocracies of the time. And it was the same thing with music, right? For the most part, music didn't talk about these things, for a very long time at least. And then when there was a message for people who were, let's say, not the cream of the crop of society, it was like, whoa, like, holy shit, not only is this person listening to me, but he's understanding what I'm, like, let's say, what I'm experiencing or where I'm coming from.
Yeah, and it gives you hope where there was none before.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for me, there's one particular influence. I would usually have shied away from bringing it up, but I'll bring it up just for fun. Why not? Mm-hmm. Whoa, so, back in the day, this is years ago. We're talking, how old am I? 28? Let's say more than 10 years ago even. I was not so great with the opposite gender of females, right? Yeah. And so, like and many other guys, struggled with that.
Yeah.
Right? So I was looking at resources that maybe could help me in that particular area.
Yeah.
And you see all kinds, right? From the pickup artists to the advice they give you in mainstream movies, flowers, da-da-da. I love you, I need you, don't leave, from things you get from music and stuff like that. But I eventually went to so there's this company. It's called Real Social Dynamics, RSD, right? And the guy who heads it, his name is Owen Cook, and he is a dating coach, right? Which I think is a good way to frame it. I think words are very important, how you define someone. Right. It's a very misunderstood topic, a lot of controversy actually around, teaching men how to meet women, because from one level, if you're, for example, if there's the kind of, like the pickup artist, right? Quote unquote, the manipulative techniques and this and that and tactics, I never resonated with that. On one level, yeah, it's interesting at first. You're like, oh, there's these things you can say, and great, okay. But it doesn't really change who you are as a person. It's just like this little mask, or this thing that isn't you. Say you did even use manipulation. Say you used all your techniques. After that's done, what's left is that person who didn't change and all that. Yeah. So back to RSD, Real Social Dynamics. There was this program I watched. Yes, this was this was like between 18 and 20. I can't remember the exact age I was. And it's called Blueprint Decoded. Now, I'm not going to fully describe what was in it, but there was this one part where he makes this distinction, which I had never made before in my life, which I had never heard quite put this way, that when I heard it, it was like a paradigm changer. Like, I was like, whoa. So he made this distinction between when you're, quote unquote, in your head, and thinking and trying to fish out information to speak to someone, to give them info, as opposed to when you're outside of your head and things are kind of just free-flowing, and you're able to just communicate in this kind of free-flow way. Kind of this is kind of related to what we talked about in our first episode with flow state.
Yeah.
And he would basically in the program talk about how to kind of get yourself into that flow state. And also these distinctions along with those techniques to kind of get yourself into the present moment. It was the first time I was ever exposed to anything like that. Like, it was intense. Like, of course, you could get this kind of info from other sources. Like, let's say an Alan Watts, but I'll get to that. Yeah, when I...
Alan Watts was my dating coach.
Actually, that's not that crazy thing to say. I think that's that works. But yeah, like, when I learned about it from Real Social Dynamics, like, these certain concepts... Yeah, and they were... By the way, this is like a... They count as like a self-help kind of group. They're not like officially an academic source of information. So, yeah, if somebody is like listening to this and they're like, no, I'd like to stick strictly to academic sources of info, please do. I encourage that, actually. I think that on one level, I think you should learn from everyone. Another level, I think you should just integrate everything in the smartest way possible. And a lot of it still, like, you should go back to academic sources to kind of stick to, information from qualified people. But, yeah, when I learned from them about being present to the moment, or ego, it's the first time I ever heard of this stuff.
Okay.
And I'm like, whoa. And the way he talked about it, the way he framed it, it was perfect for my map. It hit every single button that I needed to be hit for me to understand that. So that was very interesting. And since we're actually on the topic of the present moment and all that, another big influence was Eckhart Tolle. Or Eckhart Tolle. I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name. Depends what country you're in. That's neither here nor there. So I heard about the book Power of Now from Blueprint. So I decided, okay, I'm going to read the book. By the way, just so everybody here knows, and you as well, I didn't like reading. I hated reading. I didn't understand it. I was like, guys, we have video games, we have music.
blunts, video games, what else do we need?
We have, like, all these things, all these distractions. But I guess at the time I didn't appreciate, even though, like, the undertaking of reading a book is kind of this long-term process, there's not this short-term gratification that you can get from a soundbite or this or that. That was, not the first time, but one of the first few times that I said, no, I'm going to read this book. One, because I was inspired by RSD to, let's check it out. Let's learn about how to get into the present moment. What is this? What is this whole thing about? So I read The Power Now, and as I'm reading it, I'm almost getting into the feeling as well as I'm talking about it. Actually, the way that Eckhart Tolle frames your inner experience, like what happens when you think about thinking, right? And how thinking works for you, and certain daily situations, how you might react to certain things. The way he talks about it, again, it was a way that I resonated with. Let's say, here's the line that just popped up into my head. I feel bad. I almost wanted to have specific references, but maybe in the future. But one particular thing I remember right now is, and this actually resonated with me, when you're thinking about the past, you're thinking about it now. When you're thinking about the future, you're thinking about it now. However, the past has no reality of its own, and neither does the future, except as a thought form. And put in that particular way, again, it was like the first time hearing things like that. So I'm like, whoa, yeah, wow, yeah, the past is a mental construct. The future is a mental construct. What would be quote unquote real? Suppose whatever I'm directly experiencing at this moment. As I started to process that, slowly but surely, this wasn't instant. Like, some stuff was instant. Yeah, you read the book, there are times you feel the most euphoric, you feel great, you feel just, it's fantastic, because as you're reading, it kind of puts you in a certain state as you read, too. So that's cool.
Yeah.
But there were things also that slowly started to unravel for me. Like, those things that I was very heavily attached to, certain thoughts about the past, or anxiety about the future, it started to lose its hold on me. And I started to be able to actually be there in terms of maybe even interacting with someone. Like, for instance, as we're speaking right now, I'm not fishing for any particular thoughts. The words are just coming out. You may be able to tell that from the tone of my voice and how the words are coming out. Maybe if I was thinking about something, there would be little delays. Maybe, I don't know. Depends on how our audience perceives this. But
you're
anyone who knows, like, micro behaviors.
Right.
Yeah. But, yeah, at least in this moment, I'm definitely in the now, quote unquote. Yeah. And it's so fascinating when you are aware of these things because the fact that it's not so mainstream, we kind of just go through the motions. Yeah. And it's all based on our environment and nowadays social media, movies, this, that. But depending on the person, it's almost arbitrary the kind of influences that reach them. And this can make all kinds of results as far as people are concerned. Right. All the way from the most extreme bad, like, I don't know, somebody who hates themselves, hates the world, this, that, and that. I'm sure that person exists. That's not out of the question to believe that exists. All the way from there to a person who maybe, I don't know, I mean, okay, whatever, loves everyone and all that. Right. Not that you have to love everyone or anything like that. I'm not trying to say anything like that. But, yeah, we create all kinds of people based on the influences that they have. But I feel like this particular influence, at least knowing about the present moment, doesn't have to be from Eckhart Tolle. Doesn't have to be from us. Doesn't have to be from Tim Ferriss or who else talks. Do you know any particular therapists or doctors who might talk?
John Kabat-Zinn. So he's the mindfulness, pretty much therapy or mindfulness not therapy necessarily, but mindfulness meditation. He is the founder, if we can even call it that. Not even a founder. He's like the Alan Watts, right, who sort of brought Eastern mysticism to America.
But he's like a qualified person.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Oh, he's a PhD. I think he's a clinical psychologist.
Which is, by the way, that's very important. That's super important because, how should I put this? Yeah, there are certain influences, like, for example, the one I was talking about, Eckhart Tolle. Right. I think he's fantastic. Thing is he going to resonate with everyone? Right. It's actually, he speaks very practically. He seems like somebody who comes from that spiritual world, so it's not an academic at all. Right. However, believe it or not, his way of speaking is not very woo-woo at all. Except for the times that it is, and then maybe somebody won't resonate with that.
Right, and I think what you're also saying is that you don't sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater. If you don't agree with the particular aspect of his philosophy, it doesn't mean that all of it is bunk. And and I think we kind of see that with, let's say, even with Stoicism. And so I love Stoicism, right?
Seneca.
Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, right? Epictetus. So the idea with Stoicism, and I'm sure obviously you know, and so like, people, there's a sort of a section of people who are like, oh, like this is like, you can't do this, right? It doesn't work. You can't just make yourself not feel angry, sad, scared, etc. So not really the point of Stoicism. So when we talk about Stoicism, it's really this idea that, let's say, we can manage and control our emotions based on our own reason. And that's what cognitive therapy is based on. That's what rational emotive behavior therapy is based on. And so essentially psychotherapy, if you can kind of chalk it up into sort of one big school of philosophical thought, can be traced back to Stoicism. And so the reason why I bring this up is that there are a lot of people who do the same thing, where they don't like certain ideas in Stoicism, and they're like, okay, let's just throw it out. So like grief, right? There's this idea that, okay, well, you shouldn't really be upset if a person dies because obviously they're a human being and all human beings die, so it doesn't really make much sense. I get it. I understand why that idea wouldn't resonate with many people. When I'm in session with my clients, I don't say, hey, by the way, Seneca said this thing, you should really...
No, I hear you. Yeah. It's not going to hit them the right way.
Right, and it's not, and technically, I don't even agree with that idea. first of all, not only philosophically but psychologically speaking, you're supposed to grieve losses. So it's not a good idea. I don't agree with it. But as a whole, Stoicism is actually phenomenal, because what we do and what we teach in cognitive therapy is that you can use your reason to, let's say, take your anxiety or depression from, if we were to hypothetically give it a percentage, a 90 and a 95 to, let's say, maybe a 50 or a 60. And the point of that is that you're supposed to use your emotions. You're supposed to, let's say, be sad, you're supposed to be anxious, right? These aren't feelings that you're supposed to just kind of get rid of, and that's never the point. But what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to use them for something, right? For some sort of, let's say, hopefully some sort of change. Unless the feeling is grief, then you're unfortunately just, you have to go through it. But when it comes to kind of sadness and it comes to anxiety, you're asking yourself, okay, why am I feeling scared? What am I supposed to do to, let's say, reduce the emotion outside of kind of, that rational aspect of, let's say, my psyche or me? And so the answer is usually, okay, I have to take these steps to make sure that I'm safe. And if I'm upset about something, right, how do I make sure that I'm not upset about it again? Or how do I make sure that I'm not upset about it now? But the point is, in these different schools of thoughts, right, just like, last week we focused on utilitarianism and deontology, right? So all of those schools of thoughts have holes in them, every single one of them. There's, philosophically speaking, you could sort of break any school of any aspect of a school of thought, not any aspect, that's wrong. So you could break down certain aspects of these schools of thought and say, okay, this is where it's bad, or these are its flaws. But to sort of, just like with Eckhart Tolle, just to throw it away just because you don't believe with the spiritual aspect of it, which obviously I don't. I mean, I'm an atheist. So I think it's kind of, I mentioned
it or not, it's not even, there's no religious flavor to that.
I hear you.
It's real, I mean, let's stick to what you're saying, though.
Yeah.
I don't want to...
Yeah, but my point is just not to throw everything away, because I think, and especially with Eckhart Tolle, I mean, I'm not a huge fan of him, but I do like a lot of his ideas, and so my point is that sort of I incorporate these ideas. And just like when we talk about people who, let's say, inspired us, and so let's say, like with Tupac, again, so I don't love everything about Tupac. There are things that he's done and said that I'm like, get the fuck out. Like, I definitely don't agree with it, and I would not do that myself. Not to say I'm perfect, right, but just to say, like, those behaviors, I definitely, I'm like, that's not cool. Yeah, so, but the point is that I don't dislike him because of that, which is what a lot of people do with certain readings, with, let's say, certain philosophical systems. What they do is they say, okay, this particular thing doesn't make sense, or it's not true, or it doesn't work, let's get rid of all of it. Like with Eckhart Tolle, maybe. Oh, well, let's say he's into Eastern philosophy, right, and I'm an atheist and materialist, so let's get rid of him. No, it doesn't work that way. There's certain ideas that you can take out that will actually be sort of practically useful for your life.
Yeah, and let's see, one person I wanted to bring up. Well, actually, no. Sorry. To stick to Stoicism for a second. Mm-hmm. Marcus Aurelius. There's a quote I'm going to paraphrase. I don't remember it verbatim, mm-hmm. but it's you can't, even though you have no control over the things that happen, the events that occur. Yeah. You do have control over your relationship to them, your interpretation of that particular instance, mm-hmm. and that's where your power is. Yeah. And that's very, very interesting, because a lot of things that happen to us, sometimes we just go with the motions. It's so automatic. Mm-hmm. You're caught up in the momentum of what's going on that you almost forget that you can do that. Mm-hmm. But when you remember these things, or you're taught that, or it's... Again, like once upon a time, I would just, like I just said, go with the motions. Right. When I started to understand things like this, like that your interpretation of things definitely affects how you're going to behave and how this whole thing's going to go. Mm-hmm. It's very interesting. I suppose, let's say me and a friend had an argument about nothing special in particular. I don't know. I guess let's just say it was nothing big. I don't want to get into anything specific, but let's say it's something that I decided to take very close to heart, and they did as well. Mm-hmm. And then we decided not to speak. Mm-hmm. But that's, if you really broke it down, is that smart? Mm-hmm. Like, say, what if I interpreted that argument that we had as not that big of a deal, or perhaps there's the way to go about it where this long-term relationship I have with my friend could be preserved, and I could think about it differently.
And what if you misinterpreted the argument?
What if I misinterpret?
Right, because we do that all the time. Yeah. And then we get upset. And I can tell you this happens to me on not on a daily basis, but definitely frequently enough, where I'll say something. Yeah, and I'll say something, and the person will say, oh, are you saying I'm stupid, or are you saying I'm a liar? I'm not saying any of those things, right? So, but that's sometimes the interpretations that people take. And so, interestingly enough, why again, obviously, I go to this because this is what I do for a living, and sort of this idea that comes from Stoicism and from cognitive therapy is essentially that our core beliefs impact the way we see the world. They, what's the word? They color it, they inform it, whatever term you want to use. So it's like if I believe, let's say I'm a liar, if I believe I'm stupid, if let's say I believe I'm not a good friend, honestly, so if I believe I'm a bad person, what that's going to do is, in terms of the way our brain works, is it's going to allow us, or it's going to cause us rather, to interpret the world or interpret what people say to us in a particular way. So if, let's say, a person says to me, let's say your friend, so they say to me, you know what, I'm really mad at you, and my belief is that I'm a bad friend or that I'm a bad person, and my interpretation is, wow, he hates me, or he thinks I'm a bad person, or he thinks I'm a bad friend, of course. Mm-hmm. So the thing is, for us, it's like the way sometimes scientists do, and I'm not saying all scientists are even close to do this, but some do, that they cherry pick information to prove their beliefs, right? And sometimes, and a lot of times, they actually don't know that they're even doing this. But because of confirmation bias, what we do is we tend to sort of not necessarily say, I'm going for this information, but we literally focus on information that proves our beliefs and filter away sort of all of the things that are inconvenient to us. And so when we talk about this idea of, let's say, of interpreting, it's always informed, well, not always, I'm not saying that. If it's rational, if it fits reality, then the interpretation is correct. But if it's informed by our core beliefs, a lot of times what happens is we overreact. Like, he's saying I'm a bad friend, he's offended me, he said I'm an idiot, he said I'm stupid. And if you actually, let's say, if we were to rewind that conversation and you were to actually listen to what that person said, not only was it likely that that wasn't said, obviously depending on who your friend is, but it's also likely that that wasn't even implied. But your interpretation was essentially colored by this core belief of, I'm an idiot, or I'm this, or I'm that. So we have to be really careful with our thinking.
Yeah, and at those points we tend to react.
Yeah.
And just kind of go with that. But if we had the, what's a good word? If we had impulse control. Mm-hmm. Prefrontal cortex.
Right.
That's in charge of your personality.
Just be really careful with that too. So just for the simple fact that sometimes we think like, let's say, oh, it's biological, right? I have no impulse control, so therefore I react this way, and therefore we kind of excuse it away.
Oh, no.
Yeah, because, I mean, you can develop impulse control. That's the point of cognitive therapy. So your behaviors change your brain, right? Your brain alters or affects your behaviors, and sort of it exists in the cycle. So it's not like one person has poor impulse control, and that's it, right?
It's something that can be developed. For me, for instance, I had poor impulse control. I'd be very reactive once upon a time. Built it up, whether it's through understanding, like from the kind of stuff that we're speaking about now, and also through practice.
Yeah.
Right.
What helps?
Like,
what techniques help for you, like to practice, in terms of like reducing impulse control?
So there would be times when I would actually spend the whole day paying attention to my thoughts, and so I would. The attempt was to be present to the moment, meaning like, just for instance, I don't know if I don't want to mess with this sound, but whatever. I'm touching this mic, and then it would be all about. Like, this is weird. I don't want to get too weird, but like
very Buddhist.
But I would like really pay attention to my direct experience,
right,
and also any particular thoughts I had during the day, and kind of let. As much as possible, try to just let them pass and go. Mm-hmm. One particular quote I'm going to paraphrase is, I think it's Alan Watts said it, something about your mind is like the sky and your thoughts are like the clouds, and you let the clouds just kind of go through.
Just sort of allow them to come and go.
Yeah, to come and go.
So, and interestingly enough, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to...
No, go ahead.
So,
I was kind of...
Yeah, no, but I want to definitely go back to your techniques, but just, I think this is a really important point that Alan Watts made, and we also use this in therapy, obviously. So, but this is more so along the lines of acceptance and commitment therapy, but even still, this is actually really sort of, or it can be used, it doesn't matter, in any form of therapy, where, so... If you actually accept your interpretations, whether of yourself, whether of the other person, right, or let's say of the world around you, if they are negative, right, and you accept them as fact, what happens is they intensify and they persist. You essentially feed into them. So people often think that they're controlled by their brains and they're controlled by their beliefs. And it's actually the opposite. It's not the case, right? Or at least it doesn't have to be. So if, let's say, you have a particular belief that, let's say, I'm worthless, or I'm, let's say, whatever it is, right? I'm a bad friend. I'm a bad person. So if you do what Alan Watts said, right? If you just sort of allow it as a cloud to kind of come and go, right? It's just another feeling, and it's just another thought. Or rather, it's a thought connected to a feeling, right? So I'm angry, I'm sad because I feel X. Okay, so you allow it to come and go. But if you accept it as a fact, what happens is that it intensifies that feeling, right? The belief is strengthened, and then it persists.
So, for instance, this is why understanding plus techniques is interesting. So, from the or the understanding aspect of it, let's say we go back to, let's say, Eckhart Tolle.
Mm-hmm.
So, that idea that your thoughts are a mental construct, that there's no reality to it, in the sense that how do I put this? If you're like, it's not like your thoughts are real. Like if you think of an apple, it's not the physical apple. If you think of honey, you can't taste it. You can't interact with it. It's not real in that sense.
Right.
It's interesting. Like for example, if I had a thought like what you said, like, oh, I'm a bad friend or something like that, I wouldn't even acknowledge it as a real thought.
Okay.
Which is also part of why I, from that understanding aspect, would be able to, when practicing it, allow it to pass through.
Right.
So, for me, things like that kind of go hand in hand. It's not one or the other. But one thing that was interesting to me, once upon a time, I had some addictive behaviors. Let's relate it to food, I suppose. Other things as well, but let's say to food. There's this interesting quote, it's Alan Watts again. And let's see. If you're trying to outwit the devil, don't give him any advanced notice. Now, what does that mean? Why did he say that? So he was talking about drinking, alcoholism. He's like, if you decided not to drink, the best way not to drink is, instead of thinking about it, is the immediate decision not to drink without any particular deliberation prior to doing that. This way you don't give the devil, aka the ego, aka, not aka your mind, but he's referring to the thoughts that you have.
Your conscious psyche.
Not to give yourself any advance notice, because that kind of messes with your decision process. Things like that resonated with me because, like, the decision not to drink is not something I have to think about. I just have to not drink, which is easier said than done. But it's strange. In practice, if you try to just do the action, and I suppose try to cut out any particular thoughts about it, which is... It's a process. I was able to do it, and I am able to do it with certain things. So it does work. That's true. So is it easy? No.
So you would make your decision in the moment, like in terms of, let's say, combating your impulses?
So, yeah. So let's say, for instance, lately I've been paying attention to the food I'm eating recently. Instead of... so what I did for a while was, when I first made the decision to eat well, I did critically think about what am I supposed to eat, what are macronutrients, this, and this, supplements, yada, 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 working out, all these things I have to take into consideration. And through sheer willpower, I engaged in the actions that were helpful to me, and then over time built up the habit, and then it became kind of second nature. However, there was a point in this process when I started to, even let's say I'd go to work, I'd be thinking about how am I supposed to be eating for that day.
Right.
And actually it would kind of psych me out, and I'd end up not eating the way I would have intended to normally, ideally. So then I went back to this idea of just making the decision, like not to have any thoughts prior about it, and just decide, okay, I'm just going to eat the healthy thing immediately. Like for instance, at home, I don't have any, and this took a while to do because habits, to unwire habits,
Yeah.
It's definitely doable. It just takes a little bit of time, but it definitely is possible.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, when I gave up drinking soda, one thing that helped me was not to have soda in the house.
Right, the temptation.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Or to have certain kinds of foods in the house.
Mm-hmm.
So this way, I would surround myself with whatever it is that I need to be eating.
Yeah.
So this way, at least when I made a decision to eat, it's easier because everything's there already.
Mm-hmm.
To order food or something like that takes a little bit extra effort.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting. It's like you almost play this game with yourself where you set up things
and I think you have to. So
Yeah.
it's so interesting because like sometimes I have clients who come about like because they want to get rid of certain obsessions or compulsions, and so they say, well, I don't want to go about it like the sort of the cheap way. And I'm like, what's the cheap way? And it's something like that, like sort of reducing the temptation. But see, and that's sort of based on this erroneous concept that we have of free will. It's like we're pure free will, right? Our biology is really irrelevant, and if we just want something, we'll just stop ourselves through sort of sheer determination and resolution from doing it. Not how it works to be a human.
No, if you look
Right.
at research, there's research about decision fatigue.
Mm-hmm.
And usually in the morning when you wake up, that's when you have the most willpower.
Yeah.
And then towards the end of the day,
Mm-hmm.
especially at the very end of the day, the willpower is not so great.
Yeah.
So for instance, going back to the food thing, at least in my particular journey with it, I would be great for most of the day. Then when it comes to nighttime, I'm back home.
Mm-hmm.
Even if I made the decision earlier in the day, I'm going to eat healthy today, for some reason I'll have still that impulse to just eat the tasty thing, the short-term gratification.
Yeah.
And I will, I've many times failed due to that decision fatigue
Mm-hmm.
at the end of the day. So I had to set up my circumstances in a way while knowing that I have that. Well, actually, that we all experience that, but that in my particular case, that I have that habit.
Right.
So, but also to make the decision, back to what I was saying about like automatically choosing what's right, it's like, say somebody who's watching, let's say this is one of the first times they heard about the present moment or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
If you've been listening to the show, it's not.
Mm-hmm.
But say it's the first time hearing it,
Mm-hmm.
or how to get into the moment, how to be present,
Mm-hmm.
or be mindful, right? I suppose that would be the first place to start.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you make certain decisions without that, without thoughts kind of getting in the way, it has to be kind of from that mindful space. Otherwise, I don't know. Anytime I've been caught up in the momentum of my thoughts, it's rough sometimes to make the ideal right decision.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Even for instance, before we ever started filming the podcast, when I first heard when like you brought up like, hey, let's do a podcast. On one level, I'm like, yeah, that's really interesting. This is different. It's novel.
Mm-hmm.
It definitely it's a step. It feels like a step in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
It felt like. Also, when I thought about like, this is like my purpose. This totally aligns with my yes.
Right.
But then there was another side of me that's like, it's something new.
Scary.
Resistance.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Something I don't know how this is gonna go.
Mm-hmm.
All that kind of stuff. But I kind of had to use what we're talking about now. That ability to just do it.
Mm-hmm.
Just do it. Don't think about it. Any extra thoughts about it.
Yeah.
That was actually helpful in my particular case because in other cases in my life there were times where I've just not taken the appropriate action based on that resistance, and then would rationalize in all sorts of ways why it was a good decision.
I love that.
Backwards rationalization.
Yes,
Yeah.
and so what you're saying, and I think it ties in so well to that Alan Watts quote, is that the ego at certain times, back to our episode about being your own enemy, it is our worst enemy.
Yeah.
Right. Wow,
Yeah.
I love that.
And now that actually we're talking about backwards rationalization for a second there, if in case anyone who's listening doesn't know what that is, to feel good about our emotionally motivated actions, we tend to invent reasons after the fact that support the actions that we took. So, for instance, if I, let's say last night, I'll make an admission here as far as the food thing is concerned. For the first part of the day, I was great. I did my intermittent fasting. It's whatever, and then later in the day, it's time to eat. I decided to order my favorite thing, chicken parm.
Oh, you love chicken parm.
I love chicken parm. It is a guilty pleasure. And yes, I did work out. Also, I did that stuff. But the food was not necessarily the ideal food.
Right.
So after I ate it, I what did I do? I backwards rationalized and I said, "Oh no, it's okay. I worked out today.
Right.
It's fine. The meat in here, that's protein. Carbs, well, I've been on a low carb thing anyway, so that gives me energy. Maybe I didn't have enough energy." And I'm not joking. This is literally what I thought. I'm making fun of it, but it is true.
We do that. Yeah, we do that for our sort of morals or our behaviors too, right? It's like, maybe at first if we feel sort of, let's say, this ambivalence about something and we make a decision that we later maybe regret, we tend to rationalize backwards and say, hey, you know what? It actually makes sense in this context because X, Y, and Z.
Oh yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Especially with like relationships and stuff. A lot of people will double down instead of go back and maybe say maybe this wasn't a good rationalization or something like that. That's actually that's very fascinating. I don't know, that makes me want to think for an extra second there, but how that like in my life that works. But that's
it's so cool to tie that into the episode from 3 episodes or 2 episodes ago with the sort of that kind of ego, the devil, whatever you want to call it, being your own worst enemy. Because we do this a lot to ourselves. We sabotage ourselves, we sabotage our relationships, and it's literally because we have so much time to think and we just literally overthink things. And so I really like that idea of just sort of going about and doing things. And often in my life, that's what I actually do. So like I've struggled with an anxiety disorder, I think, since I could walk, if not before that. And so for me, the thing that actually works is not so much sitting there and doing the thought record, which definitely has its purposes at various points in my life, but it's actually just going about and making the decision and just doing it. And I often tell people that. It's like, if you're afraid, just do it. Like, literally just go and do it. Like, if you know somewhere in the back of your mind that the worst case scenario is not that bad, right? So there is some obvious thought that has to go into it. You can't just do something that's, terrifying. But if you know, like, okay, my anxiety says one thing, right, but sort of the rational part of my brain says another, then just do it and just see what happens.
And just like Shia LaBeouf said, just do it.
Right.
No, but
yeah, that's not like copywritten.
Just do it.
Right.
When for example, I was just thinking about this back in the day, going back to anxiety. Whenever I'd be on the train, let's say going to college to Hunter, I couldn't. Like, I had so much tension just being around other people. I would twitch. If I'm looking at people, I would have, like, a physical reaction. There was too much going on. I couldn't relax. Nothing like that. But then when I started to learn about, I don't know how many times I've already said this, but, like, being present to the moment and stuff, and practicing that, I would do things like, let's say I'm on the train, I would try to pay attention to my breath. Like fully like that. Also sometimes music, try to go fully into whatever music I'd listen to.
Inspirational music.
Wow. You know what just popped up in my head? So music, yes. So when I would back in the day, especially with anxiety, when I would first go to the gym, which also I didn't go all the time, but that was a whole process. That's a different conversation. But when I did go and I would, let's say, run, I would listen to music. And while I was listening to the music, I don't know how this... So, first I'll say this. I would think of different images, or let's say I'm listening to, like, a cool metal song, and I'm imagining, like, I would... especially after I learned about the ego, and this is not correct. I'm not suggesting for anyone to do this, because if you really think about it, you shouldn't do this. But I would imagine I'm fighting the ego, or something like that. Like, it's like Alen versus Dark Alen, or something like that. It's kind of cool.
You versus you, like Rocky says.
No, but it was, like, anime, cartoonish levels of fighting, how they would, like, really super fast.
Yeah.
I would imagine stuff like that while listening to music. It was fun. I would get into a flow state, which at the time I didn't know that's what it was. I was just like, oh, this is the runner's high everyone's talking about. It's fantastic. I started getting addicted to that feeling. I'm like, this is great. And why did I bring it up? Well, probably because if anyone's listening and maybe, let's say, I think music is actually a good way to get you out of your head.
Yeah.
Especially if it's something you, of course, if you really like, you really resonate with, or a song that might give you goosebumps. I think listening to that kind of stuff and or going into or listening to sources or watching sources or reading sources that bring you into that state as much as possible would really mess up that, like, any kind of negative momentum in someone's life. It definitely did for me. And yes, it was a long unraveling process or an unlearning process. Now I'm thinking about Yoda from Star Wars. He's like, you must unlearn what you have learned.
That's true, right?
Yeah.
Get rid of the habits. Habits of thinking,
Yeah. Yes.
Well, no, I'm just gonna.
no, thank you, because I started to lose the thread.
Yeah. So, I mean, what's so cool is that, like, sort of, if we think about the people who've inspired us most, I think that they're the people who've taught us to think and to sort of behave in a better way and to make our lives obviously much better, right? So it's not so much, well, it is. It's that we've identified with them and, we've identified with their struggles and said to ourselves, at least, okay, like, this is how I feel, right? And this person understands me. But it's also, this is how this person has helped me, let's say, live a better and happier life. And I can tell you of all the figures that have inspired me, right? As a lot of them obviously are going to be therapists, right? Or Ulman, who was my favorite, I think I've read 7 of his books at this point, my favorite therapist ever. He's an existential psychotherapist. His way of thinking completely changed my life. And I mean, I've even written a blog about it. That's how much I love the guy. Wow. Yeah, so him, Albert Ellis, obviously the founder of REBT, right? For you, Eckhart Tolle, Alan Watts. And for us, the thinkers, they've inspired us to such an extent where they've literally, we can say this, even beyond their graves, right? Well, except for Ulman, thankfully, is still alive, right? They've inspired us to live happier lives, because, like, I can't imagine what my life would have been like had I not read these people's books, right? And obviously had they not been inspired by their own thinkers, right? And had sort of, let's say, this lineage had not been taken back to, let's say, ancient philosophy, where a long time ago these dudes in Greece and Rome said, hey, you know what, we can actually change our lives by changing our thinking and our way of sort of behaving or a way of acting toward the world. I mean, like, I think it's just pretty amazing stuff.
Yeah, and the figures that we were inspired by were inspired by them.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating because it's like this, even though, yes, it's generational, and it is interesting that you're like, no, this has been taught throughout the ages. So back to what we were kind of talking about at the beginning, like trying to make this more of a mainstream thing. I feel it's interesting. Again, with the advent of the internet, with podcasts, with the ability to, if you resonate enough with the people that you're speaking with, it's interesting the kind of influence that you can put out there. And I'm very, very interested in seeing what happens, not just 10, let's say 20 years from now, what the internet does to people as far as making the most essential knowledge widely accessible. For instance, the internet is still not everywhere in the world. That's fascinating to me, because once it is, if we can get to that, I think it's possible. Also, we should respect certain. I don't think it maybe should be everywhere, right? We should respect nature and still have certain environments that are natural. But barring that, certain. Let's say, he's a great Joe Rogan, right? He's to me, he's a very interesting example, because he's mostly, if you really analyze him, he is a very balanced thinker. If he hears anything that opposes his view, he's actually very interested in learning why. As Stephen Covey would put it in The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, he will seek first to understand, then to be understood. That's also not something that he originated. St. Francis of Assisi.
Right. Again, the lineage.
Yeah.
Right.
But that's fine. But
and supposed to be
popular.
Right, and technically, I mean, no ideas are really original in any kind of sense, right? I think what people do, not even often, right? What they first do is they take these ideas and they sort of bring them in, or they put them in a way that's more easily digestible. But then what they do is usually they add on to them, right? So there's this really great episode, and kind of for lack of time, I'm not going to go too deep into it.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
So, I didn't even know how much time was going by. Yeah.
So I mean, it's called The Creative Brain, right? And it's I think it was a PBS special, and so what the author there argues, who was it? I think it was David Eggleman who was on it. So he's a neuroscientist. And so he argues essentially, and various people in the show argue the same thing, is that ideas aren't essentially original, right? Sort of people take them and they sort of add on to them, or they sort of, kind of alter them in some sort of way, right? Based on the information that they have, right? Based on associations that their brains are making from other things that they've learned. But the point is that nothing really is original, which is kind of cool, right? Because in a way, this ties us back to Plato, to kind of St. Augustine, right? To St. Francis. And I mean, I think it's really cool in terms of kind of what we're doing here. It's because if you think about it, right, we are the sort of progeny in some sort of sense of these 100%. People. And that's pretty cool just to be a part of.
Yeah, so, and also, I feel the vibe of like we're probably ending this.
We gotta wrap up.
So let me put this out there, because I feel like I could actually talk about this all day.
Yeah.
I actually would want to do a part 2 to this one day, because there's actually, there's a lot of ideas circulating rather.
And percolating.
Good
terms.
And
Two good terms,
yeah. I have this concept.
Yeah, this idea.
Yeah. But like figures who've also inspired me, I just want to put it out there because I kind of only talked about 2 of them. Mm-hmm. Nietzsche, and again, because in the interest of time, fine, I'll talk about it on another episode. But I'll just say their names. Nietzsche. I like Sam Harris.
Yeah, he's a good thinker. I like him a lot.
He's fantastic. As controversial as it may be, only from his clinical perspective. Mm-hmm. Jordan Peterson. And I understand that's controversial. Mm-hmm. He's not saying it, I'm saying it, so if anyone has any backlash, it's for me. So I'll take it. But yeah, again, not political, just his clinical.
Right, I hear you. Not throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
No, he's like, I really like the way he speaks and the way he outlines his thoughts. Mm-hmm. That's one. Let's see. Okay, I'm looking at a list here that I have of people. Bruce Lee.
Yeah, Bruce Lee's a good thing.
Bruce Lee was cool.
Mm-hmm.
I like that he was talking about how like you shouldn't put limits on anything you do. Mm-hmm. You should always strive to kind of go past them.
Yeah, and in terms of mental health, the greatest statement that he ever had was literally to be like water. And so, I mean, as kind of when we talk about it as mental health practitioners, what we try to tell our clients is that the sort of epitome of mental health is being able to adapt to one's circumstances. Be like water.
That's right. You put water into a cup, it becomes the cup.
It becomes a cup in some way.
Water into a tea kettle.
There you go. The point is it adapts, right? And because the thing is, and this is a whole show in itself.
Yeah. See.
It's
interesting.
Right. A lot of our suffering comes from our resistance to life, right? Yeah. So not to say that you can't be upset, not to say you can't be angry, not to say you can't be sad, but the point is you can't get trapped in those emotions. Because once you do that and you say, no, I want the world to be the way I want it to be, right? You're going to be miserable like that. So it's like that anger, that sadness, let's say maybe even the fear, right? You're essentially prolonging it by saying, nope, I'm not going to change anything. The world has to adapt to me, which is why you have to be like water.
Yeah, running water doesn't go stale.
Right, interesting.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
That's something that.
He said that. Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah. Wow, I like that.
Yeah. If it's still, it becomes kind of dirty and muddy. Yeah. But when it runs, it's nice.
Right. All right, guys. So, any final?
Fair enough.
Come on, we gotta. It's already that time.
All right, so guys, it was a pleasure talking about what inspires us with you. Yeah. I think we can definitely talk more about that on another episode. I believe we have a guest coming up next week. Look forward to that.
Yeah, so we have Jessie Manisto of Third Factor Magazine, who is a former CIA agent, and also on top of that, she is the former editor of Democratic Left, which is the official magazine of the Democratic Socialists of America.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I guess, would you want to promote anything?
I think we've done enough promoting already.
Fair enough. All right, guys, then see you next time. It was fun, and have a great day.